What's up, CFL fans? Welcome to the Canadian Football Fantasy Fix for Week 1 of the 2021 CFL season, the inaugural episode of a brand new show covering CFL Fantasy week in and week out. We'll talk through the best high-priced options, the best bang for your buck options, best budget deals, bargain bin buys, all that fun stuff. Players to watch for, players to maybe stay away from each and every week here on the Canadian Football Fantasy Fix. I'm your host, Ryan Coop. You may be wondering, before we begin, you may be wondering, who is this guy? What qualifies him to give me CFL fantasy advice? What makes him an expert? And those are all very good questions. I'll qualify this by saying before we begin, please do not go to Vegas and bet the farm on anything I say this week or any week throughout the season. I am by no means an absolute expert on CFL fantasy. I've played it for many years. I've covered the CFL on my podcast, The Canadian Football Countdown, for 7 years and counting now. I've been a CFL fan for quite a while. I'm a CFL season ticket holder. So I've watched my fair share of CFL games. I've played in CFL fantasy for the last number of years and mostly had good showings, although, hey, we all have a bad week here and there, don't we? So I have no insider knowledge, but I do spend a lot of time talking through CFL fantasy, CFL fantasy lineup decisions week in and week out. It takes me like an hour each week to set my line, I'm not going to lie. So I figured if I'm hemming and hawing over some of these choices, maybe others are too. Maybe that's where, seeing something in a video like this, you're thinking, maybe I should take that guy. And then suddenly you see somebody else thinking the same thing. Maybe that helps you make your picks. That's kind of the goal here, is to just be a resource, another option out there, CFL fantasy coverage for anybody who's looking for it. And if you're looking for it and you're here, welcome here, and I hope you join me all season long. So, let's get into talking about week 1 in the CFL. 4 games on the schedule. Kicks off Thursday, August 5th in Winnipeg. The Hamilton Tiger Cats coming to Winnipeg, face the Bombers in the 2019 Grey Cup rematch. We've also got BC and Saskatchewan, Toronto, Calgary, and Edmonton, Ottawa on the dock for week number 1. So, for the purposes of this show, full disclaimer ahead of time, I'm mostly going to be talking about the CFL fantasy game, the CFL on TSN fantasy game. I understand there are other CFL venues out there, CFL fantasy venues out there. DraftKings, single game sports betting is now legal in Canada. So I totally get that there's other options out there. This is the one I'm most familiar with and feel like I can speak on the most. That being said, if there are things, from this content, from talking about this particular game that can kind of help you out with the other games, and that's another added bonus as well. And if there's a lot of interest in me talking through, some of the lineup options on those sites as well, then as the season goes along, we can look to expand it to that as well. But primarily focusing on the CFL on TSN fantasy game. Week in and week out, you get a $40,000 salary. All the players have a salary number attached to them. And you got a lineup of 7 spots: quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a flex running back or wide receiver, and a defense to fill that up with. So without further ado, let's jump straight into it and start talking about the quarterback position. Because this can be a position that makes or breaks your fantasy week. If you can get yourself a great quarterback on your roster that's putting you up, above 20 points, that can make a lot of a difference compared to a guy who, has an off week, throws a couple picks, doesn't really pick up a touchdown, and only gets you 10 or even less. at the quarterback position. So let's dive in. Let's take a look at, here are some of my, let's start off with the top premium priced options at quarterback, and then we'll look at kind of some of the sleeper picks for week number 1. Right off the bat, number 1, he's the highest priced quarterback in the game. It's Cody Fajardo of the Saskatchewan Roughriders. This is a guy that in 2019 completed 71.5% of his passes, had over 4,000 passing yards, an 18-8 touchdown interception ratio. Also picked up 611 yards and 10 touchdowns on the ground. A very good coming out season for Fajardo, who got thrust in the starting role after Zach Collaros went down in week number 1, just a couple plays into the game. And, he's a guy that's been around the league for a while, but hadn't really had a starting shot. And he finally got it, and he excelled. He was one of the top options in the game from a fantasy perspective, averaging 20.28 points per game. So as I talked about, you want to try to get a guy over 20 at the quarterback position. Well, Fajardo averaged that week in and week out. If not consistent. If you're looking for a guy who is consistent at quarterback and can be consistent for you again this year, it's got to be Fajardo in Saskatchewan. Most of his game, he had one game less than 10 points. He had a couple over 30, but most of them were in that kind of 10 to 30 range with 7 games over 20 points. That's what you like to see. He can put up 37.1. He has that capability. He has a pretty high floor as well. One bad week here and there of 7.5, but everything else was over 10 for him last season. So 2021, I am the only thing with Fajardo I'm wondering is he had his great years as a starter. He's looked great in training camp so far. But what will we see as a sort of an air quotes sophomore season from Fajardo? He's a guy that I think has the ability to go and excel again this year, but the major question mark to me is his offensive line. He's had a couple of guys retire or say they're sitting this season out. No Brendan Labatt, no Tacoby Cofield. Guys like that will not be playing for the Riders, and they're looking a little thin at the offensive line right now. So that's a bit of a concern for me, but if you're looking for a safe option, I think in week 1 at the quarterback position, which is not a bad idea, given all the unknowns coming into this season after 2 years off. He's going to cost you quite a bit at $10,60 or $10,695, but I like the option of Cody Fajardo as a guy you know what you're going to get for the most part, if he can replicate those 2019 numbers. Moving on to our next option here, we have Trevor Harris of the Edmonton Elks. $9,805 is his salary. So he comes in a bit cheaper than Cody Fajardo does, about, I think, $800 cheaper. As much as we see Fajardo kind of be that consistent, somewhere in like the 15 to 25 point range week in and week out, I think Harris is a little bit different in that sense. He's a bit of a guy that can... when he's on his game, he's putting you up 30 points. He's putting you up 25 to 35 points on a night if he's on his game. But when he's struggling, he struggles hard too. And you can see that from these numbers here for Fajardo. 3 games less than 10 points in 2019, 4 within the 10 to 19 range, 3 and then 6 games in total above 20, including 3 of them being above 30. So spread pretty far and wide evenly throughout the season in 19 for Harris. He did put up an average of 16.38 a week, which is not too bad in his own right. He has a lot of weapons available to him this year. They have Greg Ellingson again. They bring in Darrell Walker, Monty Edwards. The Elks bring them in to help him out there. He's got a great back in James Wilder Jr., helping him out with the run game there as well. He's got his old offensive coordinator, Jamie Elizondo, back as coach and helping in that regard as well. Should be a good season for Trevor Harris, not going to lie. think he's my MOP candidate for this year. I think he's my preseason pick for MOP. We are going to see this guy light it up this season. Over 4,000 yards in only 13 games in 2019. 16 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. He did pick up 6 rushing TDs. He doesn't run the ball a whole lot. I wouldn't say he's the most mobile quarterback in the league, so there is maybe that bit of a downside to him. But I love Trevor Harris, and I love the option of Harris in week number 1 based on his matchup facing the Ottawa Red Blacks. This is a team I think a lot of people like myself are low on coming into week 1, just based on what we've seen from Ottawa last season, what we've seen this off season, and the moves they've made and the pieces they've lost. I think a lot of people, myself included, are predicting a bit of an Edmonton blowout in week number 1. And, maybe if he's facing a tough matchup, I'm staying away from Harris because of some inconsistency there for him. But when he's on his game, he puts up big, big numbers. And with this matchup against the Red Blacks, I like that option of Trevor Harris. He is a very intriguing option as a quarterback to play this week. And the third guy I want to talk about here as kind of a good option, I think a high-priced option at quarterback, is Michael Riley of the BC Lions. $9,234. In years past, this would be a no-brainer. Riley was top quarterback of the game. It was all Riley or Bo Levi Mitchell. One of these two. Which one's the best quarterback in the CFL? It's constant competition between these two. And last season, he goes to BC and he takes a bit of a dip. And, well, you could say that in more ways than one, because he constantly took a dip to the field, constantly getting knocked on his back. His offensive line didn't give him much help there. So a bit of more of a down year for Riley in 2019, less than 4,000 yards, 69.5 completion percentage, 20 touchdowns, but a pretty high 15 interceptions for Riley's standards. 204 rushing yards, 5 touchdowns on the ground to add to that as well. So they're not terrible numbers for a quarterback, but from what we're used to from Riley, definitely a down year for him. Good for only, he puts up 16.01 fantasy points on average a game. That's something you'd expect, probably. I haven't done the math on previous years for him, but I would imagine he's averaging over 20 or close to that range at least in previous years. But a down year for him. Most of his games, 10 of his games less than 20 points, but he did have 6 above, much like Trevor Harris did. And so he still had a decent season, I think. But this year, I'm expecting better because they've gone out, they've improved the offensive line. The offensive line improved mid-season when they made a change at offensive line coach. You noticed a night and day difference down the stretch, and that's when Riley had some of his best games. Some of the moves they've made this offseason, bringing in Riker Matthews, for example, is a huge addition to that O-line that's going to help Michael Riley stay upright. It's going to help give him more time to find his receivers, and he's got a couple great new receivers to add to the mix. You already have Brian Burnham. You already had Lamar Durant. Now you've got Dominic Rhymes, who put up 1,000 yards last year coming to BC. You've got a speedster in Lucky Whitehead, who I'm sure he'll hit for a long touchdown at some point this season. So I'm on the up on Riley. I think he's going to have a better year this year. And I like him as an option in week 1 against the Riders defense. Now, if you look at the stats from the past couple of seasons, the Riders defense has been very, very good. And if you might want to be a bit cautious picking against them. But they have lost so many pieces this offseason along that, the middle of the defense. They've lost some guys on the defensive line due to injury. A couple guys going to other teams, like Cam Judge, for example, and Charleston Hughes. A couple guys going to the NFL there as well, like a Derek Moncrief. So Saskatchewan's lost some pieces there. So Riley and the veteran he is and the talented quarterback he is, I could see him in week 1 coming out and lighting up that defense for a 300-yard passing game and a couple touchdowns. So I like that option of Michael Riley there. Taking a look at some of the sleeper options at quarterback, let's go and look at some of these other guys here. 2 of the ones intrigue me at a lower price point are the 2 quarterbacks for the Toronto Argonauts. And we don't know at the point of me recording this, which is Tuesday, August 3rd, which one will be the starter for week 1. We're presuming it's going to be Nick Arbuckle at this point, which would make sense because he's the big name free agent they brought over from Calgary. But Nick Arbuckle and McLeod Bethel Thompson both come at the exact same price point of $8,082 for week 1 in CFL Fantasy. Nick Arbuckle comes over from Calgary, got to start 8 games there last season, while Bo Levi Mitchell was out with injury. Completed 73.1% of his passes, very fine completion percentage there. 2,000 yards in 8 games. Expand that to a full season of play, and you're looking at a guy who's putting up over 4,000 yards passing, much like some of the other guys we've talked about. 11 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. He adds 4 touchdowns on the ground and a couple rushing yards there. 17.79 fantasy points per game for Arbuckle in the starts he had in 2019. And that's not bad. That's better than Riley had. That's a pretty good season for Arbuckle with a shorter span there. He had a pretty high floor, no games less than 10 points, so you're getting at least 10 with Arbuckle, at least in that Calgary system, and he even put up a week of 31.6. So at a low price point, he comes over with a familiar coach in Ryan Dinwiddie. He comes with some familiar options to him in Eric Rogers, Jawan Breskison coming over to Toronto as well. Maybe that's an option there. Nick Arbuckle, I think I'm a little hesitant in week 1 just because I want to see what his play is like in this Toronto system. But I do like, if he starts coming out a little consistent and his price point stays low as we get into later weeks in the season, I may be more inclined to save a bit at quarterback and go with Nick Arbuckle. And same thing if we would talk about McLeod Bethel Thompson. He's a guy who was one of the top passers in the league while playing for one of the teams with the lowest records in the previous season. 4,000 passing yards in 16 games, 26 touchdown passes. That's a lot. 13 interceptions for Bethel Thompson. Was part of a Toronto team that passed the ball a ton. Their game was, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I'm guessing about 66% pass because they were behind in so many games, right? So Bethel Thompson, definitely his stats were padded a little bit by that, but in the starts he had, he put up numbers. He put up a lot of 300-yard passing games. Good enough for 16.31 fantasy points a game on average. He did have a couple weeks again where the Argos really struggled and he put up less than 10 points. But he also had 5 games over 20 on a team that wasn't great and should be much improved this year. So if you're looking to save at quarterback, I like either of these 2 options for week number 1. Whichever one starts, make sure you check those depth charts before locking in your lineup. Let's move on to the running back position. And this is a bit of an interesting position to talk about here because I think the running back position is one of those where you can find the most diamonds in the rough. And I think there are some guys at the top of the chart that will net you a lot of points, but I think there's some lower valued options that could net you just as many. And one of those guys to kick things off here is a guy who was the backup in Edmonton last season behind CJ Gable, got only a couple games played, so he has a small sample size, But Shaq Cooper at $5,428, he isn't in that upper echelon of salary for running back, so you save a bit of money there. But he will be the starter for this BC offense that I just mentioned should be much improved this season. He should get the starting nod. 5 games played, 352 yards, also, and 2 touchdowns. Also pitched in, 15 receptions, 112 yards. That's not a bad ad for 5 games there. It's averaging 3 catches a game. 14.68 fantasy points on average for Shaq Cooper in his limited time played. I believe he had one of those games where he also wasn't even the starter. 1 or 2 of those, so boost up his stats a little bit. Those muddy with the waters a bit there. So he did put up 28.6 as his ceiling. He did have 3 games in the 10 to 19 range at the salary point, and given that he is the full-on starter now in an offense that should be much improved, I like Shaq Cooper as a running back option. He is probably my lead option for week number 1. Against that Saskatchewan defense I mentioned earlier that is missing a lot of pieces from last season and is missing a lot of guys due to injury. So could we see a 100-yard rushing game from Cooper in week 1? We will see. We will have to see. But I like the option, especially at the salary he comes at as kind of a middle-of-the-pack salary option. Next up, going over to Edmonton, we've got James Wilder Jr. as a guy I like for week 1, $5,722, so a bit more expensive than Shaq Cooper. Wilder Jr. is a guy who in his rookie season absolutely stormed on the scene of the CFL, had an outstanding season, expectations for him were through the roof, and then all of a sudden he struggled in his next season or 2 from there. Never really got going. Last season, never was really properly utilized in that Toronto offense last season. In 2019, they passed the ball so much that he really didn't get to do a whole lot along the ground. In fact, fantasy points wise, he more than 66% of his points came through the air. 415 receiving yards, 464 on the ground. More touchdowns through the air than the ground as well. So Wilder Jr. is a guy who can add some offense through the air, which is a great fit for that Edmonton offense that I think is going to pass the ball quite a bit as well. So he's a running back that can catch the ball, do a lot of great things when he catches it. I could see some Trevor Harris dump passes going his way. And as I mentioned before, I like that matchup with the Red Blacks in week 1. So you'll see a recurring theme here where I like the options of members of that Edmonton offense. And, it's interesting because which Wilder Jr. are we going to see? Are we going to see that rookie year explosive guy who can bust out 100, 200-yard games? Or are we going to see the guy who struggled a little bit more in his subsequent years? He seems fired up to be in Edmonton. I like him as a fit in that offense. I think we're going to see Elizondo use him decently well in that offense as well. He did that with his running backs in Ottawa as well. Go back to William Powell, who had some great seasons with the Red Blacks before going to Saskatchewan. So I'm high on Wilder Jr., and I think he's a great option to attack in week 1, especially if the Elks can get a couple touchdowns early in the game, get ahead a little bit, and start running the clock down late in the second half. Just feed the ball to Wilder Jr., and if you have him in fantasy, that could be a great day for you. And then my third option at running back that I like for week 1 as a kind of higher price, good option is William Powell of the Saskatchewan Roughriders. He's a guy that, as I just mentioned, had some great seasons in Ottawa, came over to Saskatchewan last season with the Riders, put up over 1,000 yards played full 18 games, added 12 touchdowns on the ground, a couple hundred yards through the air and a couple touchdowns there as well. Good enough for 14.44 fantasy points a game, so just below the 15-point mark. Just under $7,000 is his salary. Not a bad season for William Powell in 2019. Had an amazing week, 35.1 points. 1 week during the season. Most of his weeks, though, did hover in the lower range of things, in the 15 or less points, I would say. 5 games less than 10 points, 9 games in the 10 to 19 range, only 4 games over 20 points. So there's a reason I put Powell behind Shaq Cooper, James Wilder Jr. here, because I think those two are more strong options for week 1 in the sense that, Powell can have good games, but for the most part, he's kind of shown himself to be, and the way he's utilized in that Saskatchewan offense, a kind of middle consistency. He has a consistent floor for you, but is not all consistently going to break wide open, in my opinion. And so there's some hesitation just based on him having one of the higher salaries in taking him there. And also some hesitation, the aforementioned offensive line issues for Powell or for the Riders. How is that going to affect their offense? The one thing I'll say in his favor based on that, though, is maybe they give him the ball a little more often just to give Cody Fajardo some more time back there. Maybe they give him a couple dump passes along the way as well. So I don't mind Powell as a running back in week 1 if you can fit him in with his cap hit at 6,919. You might be asking, where are some of these other guys, these higher priced running backs? Where's Andrew Harris? Where's John White? Where's Sean Thomas Erlington? Well, Andrew Harris, we still don't know at this point, as I'm recording this, whether he'll be playing in week 1. He looks doubtful. He hasn't practiced a whole lot. And even if he does play, he's facing Hamilton's defense, which is pretty strong. And if he's got a bit of an injury or something nagging him, I'm a little hesitant to go and pay the salary that Harris comes at in week number 1. Same thing with John White. I like the option out in Toronto. I want to see what that Toronto offense looks like, though, before I buy in on John White. He's a great running back. But salary-wise, like I said, I like some of these cheaper options. So I'm hesitant to go with John White. Sean Thomas Erlington's an interesting one to me because he's one of my favorite running backs in the league, and I think he'll be the breakout running back star of this season. But he's facing Winnipeg's defense, which was number 1 against the run last season. He's also got a crowded backfield there. You've already got Malik Irons in there. You've got Jackson Bennett in there. Now they bring in Don Jackson in the offseason. How many touches will they be splitting them throughout the year? Will they be focused, giving the ball to Sean Thomas Erlington all game long? I need to wait a week or two, especially given the matchup, before I take him as my running back in week number 1. But I do like him at a lower salary in the 4,000s level there as an option in weeks going forward. Well, looking at some of the cheaper options at running back, I think there's some interesting plays out in Ottawa here. And number 1 to me is Timothy Flanders coming out at $3,588. Last season, he did not play in the CFL. He skipped the 2019 season. He was not signed by anyone, I believe. If he did not get on the active roster and register any stats. 2018 had a couple games with the Bombers. His last full year in a CFL lineup was the 2017 season, and he was back up to Andrew Harris there. But he got some playing time in a dual back system. He's got some familiarity with Matt Nichols, with Paul Lapalisse, who's the head coach there now. So he should be the starting running back for Ottawa this week. And I kind of like the option of Timothy Flanders as a cheaper option here. That 2017 season, 10 games, again, a lot of them as kind of a backup option and not full starter, not time. 254 rushing yards, 1 touchdown, also 206 yards and 3 touchdowns through the air. So Not a bad backup season for Flanders. So you might be asking then, why pick him in week 1? You don't like the matchup with Edmonton. You think Edmonton's going to dominate this game. Is Flanders really going to get that much of the ball if they're trailing? Paul LaPolice I've seen his offense in Winnipeg. You know, he likes to use his players in interesting ways. He loves the check down passes, especially with Matt Nichols, to his running backs. And I think Flanders can be that guy that's putting up as a running back. He put up 7 receptions in the game. That's 7 points right there. Potentially, he could put up 100 yards combined through the ground and the air. So, you know, he gets a couple of receptions. He gets 100 yards combined. Well, then you're looking at over 10 points already. Maybe he gets a touchdown in there. I like Flanders as that option based on how we've seen LaPolice run his offenses and use his running backs. The other option I like out in Ottawa is Anthony Coombs, a guy that's listed as a running back, but is not necessarily going to be utilized as a running back on the team. I think he can spend some time at running back. He could spend some time at wide receiver. With Hamilton in 2019, 10 games, 158 yards on the ground, 156 through the air, a couple touchdowns through the air as well. You know, only 6.34 fantasy points a game, which is not great. This is a stretch sleeper pick for week 1 for me. For one of the same reasons I love Flanders, and that's the way LaPolice runs offenses and the way he loves his trick plays. And the way he loves to utilize his players in different ways. See how he used a guy like Lucky Whitehead here in Winnipeg, you know, as a speedy receiver who could go and he handed the ball off to him occasionally. He had these check down screen passes to him, let him run with the ball. I could see Coombs being a guy that LaPolice loves and that Nichols forms a connection with. And all of a sudden we see him get more used heavily in this offense, whether it's at running back or wide receiver. So it's maybe a big stretch for week 1, but $3,400 for Coombs. If you want to take a chance on a guy, he could be the guy. He could be an option for you there. I like the sleeper value of Anthony Coombs for week 1 against Edmonton. Moving on to the wide receiver position, there are so many options at wide receiver and so many different price points. Let's break it down to kind of upper, medium, and lower end salaries. Upper salaries, you know, guys anywhere from $7,000 to Brandon Banks, who's something like $14,000, which is absurd, but warranted based on his stats. There's some great options in this upper echelon of receivers, and it's a matter of which one is going to have his outstanding day this week. And there's so many options available, but there's some in particular that I find intriguing here. Number 1 being Greg Ellingson of the Edmonton Elks. You know, they're going to have a big passing game against Ottawa, the Elks are. Darrell Walker, Greg Ellingson, Armani Edwards, take your pick. It's hard to know which one's going to have the biggest day. So why do I like Ellingson? Well, I like Ellingson particularly because his price point's the middle between the 3 guys I just mentioned. He's the one who's been in Edmonton with the current offense the longest. He's, you know, they bring in Darrell Walker. He's going to draw a lot of attention away from Ellingson. He's got that connection with Trevor Harris already. He's got that connection with Jamie Elizondo from his time in Ottawa, to get their time in Ottawa together. So I like Ellingson as the feature wide receiver in this offense. And I think those additions of Walker and Edwards are going to draw a bit of attention away from him. And maybe all of a sudden, you know, everybody's covering him or them, and we see a big day from an Ellingson. 1170 yards, 5 touchdowns in 2019. Averaged 16.74 fantasy points a game. Put up a couple games even over 30 points even, including a week of 39 points. So, you know, most of his games do fall in that kind of middle of 10 to 19 points is where he had the majority of his games this past season, which for a wide receiver, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's good to have a consistency, and if you want a guy with a high floor, I would say, to me, that's Greg Ellingson, especially given the matchup this week. Another intriguing option for me, if we head to Hamilton here, is Braylon Addison of the Ticats. $9,167, so he's quite a bit more expensive than Greg Ellingson. But 16 games, 1,236 yards, 7 touchdowns, also put up a couple hundred and a touchdown on the ground. He had 36 carries, which is unusual for a wide receiver, but Hamilton loves to use him in that way. Averaged himself 18.03 points a game in 2019, had 9 games in that 10 to 19 point mark, a couple games over 20, a couple games over 30, even a game over 40 at 42. He's got a high floor, much like Ellingson. He comes with a higher price, and he can break a game wide open. And he's an option I like because I love Brandon Banks. I think he's the best receiver in the game. In fact, in a fantasy draft this week, I took him first overall. But when it comes to his salary in CFL and TSM Fantasy, Brandon Banks is hard to fit into a lineup. So if you're looking at the next best option of a Hamilton team that's going to come out hungry to shut up the Grey Cup party out in Winnipeg here, Braylon Addison's that guy. He can torch a defense. Mazzoli, if they're going to come out firing, I could see him firing bullets to Banks and Addison all day long. So at a $5,000 cheaper salary, he averages about 6 points less a game than Banks does. At least did last season. But if you save $5,000 and spend that elsewhere in the lineup, I like Addison as an option in Hamilton. I think that game between the Ticats and the Bombers could be a barn burner. I think we could see a high-priced game, or a high-scoring game, between those two teams. And if that's the case, expect a big game from Braylon Addison. So definitely, if you can fit that salary in your lineup, an excellent option for week number 1. Sticking with the high-priced options here, the other big one for me this week is Brian Burnham in BC. $10,265. So he is in the upper echelon of prices, I believe only behind Brandon Banks. 17 games played, 1,492 yards, and 11 touchdowns through the air for Burnham in 2019. Again, BC kind of struggled offensively a little bit that season. Riley was a little bit off his game. We expect Riley to get back on his game this season. And with that, Burnham should have another outstanding year. He's a guy that can, again, put up massive weeks, 40.5 points in 1 week last season. That's huge if you can get that in your lineup. And averaging 18.56 points a game. Now, that's a pretty good addition to get from a wide receiver in your lineup. It is one of the top average points per game, definitely in the league. And that's why his salary is so high as well. So I like Burnham. He's always a reliable guy. He's a guy that is going to get a solid number of receptions week in and week out. If they're nearing the end zone, Riley's going to be looking Burnham's way. The only thing I may be a bit hesitant on him with is what the impact of the new additions to BC's offense bring on his workload. Bringing in Dom Rhymes, bringing in Lucky Whitehead, for example, and seeing, what kind of role are they going to play in the offense? Are they going to take some of those targets away from Burnham? Do we have new additional touchdown threats that may take touchdown options away from him as well? So a little hesitant on Burnham there in that sense. So I like these other options, high-priced options that I mentioned, Ellingson and Addison, a little bit more than I like Burnham, but he's certainly always a top option to fit if you can fit in your lineup and you believe in the matchup. And I think it'll be a good matchup against that Riders defense. Let's move on to the middle-priced options at wide receiver. These are guys kind of in the $4,000 to $6,000 range I've got my eye on. And number one is one of the guys I just talked about out in BC, and that's Dominic Rhymes. 1,056 yards, 5 touchdowns in 17 games in 2019 on an Ottawa team that had nothing going for them offensively. That's a pretty big feat to be able to put up over 1,000 yards. Given all of their offensive struggles. A real strong coming out party season for Rhymes, being the featured receiver pretty much in that offense. Averaged himself 11.8 points per game, even put up a week of 33.8, so he has that high ceiling. We know what he's capable of. 7 games less than 10 points. Again, Ottawa struggled offensively, that's to be expected. But 8 games in that 10 to 19 point mark. So, a solid production, not necessarily a game breaker week in and week out, but in that kind of middle salary range, based on these stats from his time in Ottawa. And now that he's going over to play in BC in what should be a much better offense for him to play in, I like Rhymes, and I could see him being a go-to receiver for Michael Riley there. He's a big receiver. He's a tall receiver. He can bring a deep ball down. We know Riley loves to throw those deep balls. I'm expecting week 1 at least one long pass that comes down in Dominic Rhymes' arms. And that alone is going to put you hovering close to that 10 fantasy point mark already. And that's just off of one catch. So I'm high on Dominic Rhymes at that middle salary point coming into week number 1. Another guy I like in that salary range is Hergy Mayala out in Calgary. He played in 12 games in 2019, but I only started really getting heavily featured and involved in that offense in the latter couple games of the season. Final 5 games of the year, 406 yards and 5 touchdown passes. That's averaging, I believe, almost quick math here, 80 yards a game and a touchdown. His full season stats in 10.51 fantasy points per game. Again, that didn't include that's not just focused on when he was heavily featured in that offense. So, 5 touchdowns in 5 games is pretty good, not gonna lie. And we should see Mayala have the same level of usage as he did down the stretch in Calgary, if not more this year. No Eric Rogers, no Reggie Bagleton. So he should be one of the featured receiver options for the Stampeders this year. And watch him replicate those numbers, if not more, this season. So I like him at $5,533. I like Hergy Mayala as an option in week number 1 against the Argos. Speaking of the Argos, my other option here at the middle price point that I like is a guy who's coming over from Calgary's system, and that's Jawan Breskison. Only played 4 games in 2019 due to injury, but in those 4 games, 3 touchdown catches, 168 yards on 11 catches, including, I believe, if I remember correctly, some absolute beautiful catches from Jawan Breskison. Averaged in those couple games 11.45 fantasy points. That's not bad at a $4,179 salary. And, the sample size is small, so it gets a little sketchy there, sure. But I do like I do like the fact that he's coming over from Calgary with Arbuckle, with Ryan Dinwiddie. There's some familiarity between those 3. I could see them leaning heavily on the guys that Arbuckle's familiar with in the first couple of the weeks of the season. And if Breskison can continue that pace that he did in those few games he played last year, I like him as one of the best receivers in Toronto's offense for this season. So his price is low now. I think it's going to jump as we go throughout the season. But I like Breskison in week number 1 as a fantasy option at the wide receiver position in that middle dollar range. Moving on to a couple sleepers at the wide receiver. These are guys less than $3,000 salary that you may be able to fit in your lineup. If you want to take a chance on a guy, there's a couple options here that are intriguing to me that I think could present interesting, fun options. Their salary is low, so if they don't produce a ton, it doesn't hurt you there if you are able to get some of those higher priced guys I've already talked about. But they have the potential, if they put up 10 points at a $2,500 salary, it is a great addition to your fantasy team for a week. So looking at some of those options here, there's two guys that stick out to me. The first one being Devontae Dedmon of the Ottawa Red Blacks. 5 games only in 2019, mostly featured as a return specialist. 887 return yards, 2 touchdowns off of returns as well. I believe they came in the same game, and a heck of a game against Montreal. I still remember that one return where he bounced off 8 tackles, I think it was, on the way to a touchdown. It was a real thing of beauty from Devontae Dedmon. He only had 4 receptions for 58 yards, so he wasn't used in the offense, but he's a guy that I could see starting to get more into that offensive role on top of the return role he already has. Look no further than Brandon Banks. Banks was a guy as well that in his first couple seasons was primarily just a return guy, an explosive return guy, and then they threw him in the offense as well. And look at him, he's the highest priced player in the game. He's the best receiver in the league. Do I think Dedmon's going to become the best receiver in the league this season? No, not necessarily, but that aforementioned LaPolice offense, where he likes to use players in interesting ways, I could see Dedmon being used as that speedy guy that they try to send deep for a couple long passes that way. I could see him being used as a guy on a couple sweeps, maybe screen passes, let him go, much like Lucky Whitehead was in Winnipeg. So I like Dedmon as a sleeper there. If he can get a bit involved in the offense on top of the 11 points per game he was already putting up, primarily in the return game, you could have a guy who at under $3,000 is putting you up a 15 to 20 point week. And if that's happening in week 1, I'm saying yes, please. The other option I like at the cheaper wide receiver position is $2,500 wide receiver for the Saskatchewan Roughriders, Braden Lenius. He's a guy who only had, I think, 2 catches last season. He was drafted by the Riders in the second round of the 2019 draft. So last season was a rookie season, didn't get involved too much in the offense that year. But coming into camp this year, he's really put himself forward as a guy who made a good impression. I believe, I was reading earlier today, cut 30 pounds coming into camp to get himself in great game shape. He's had an excellent camp so far. Cody Fajardo, quarterback for the team, even saying that he's been the MVP of camp, and he could see him being 1,000-yard receiver this year. So if your team's star quarterback is saying a guy's going to be a 1,000-yard receiver, well, the quarterback kind of has a hand in that, in the sense that he's the one throwing him the ball. So if he believes he's going to be a 1,000-yard receiver, that means he's thinking of looking his way quite a bit this season when he's throwing the ball. So you could expect this guy to come into the lineup and make an impression real quick, real early in the season. And if that's the case, his salary will rise as the season goes along. But $2,500 in week 1, I like it. If I'm looking for a sleeper pick and I need some way to save cash, he's the guy right there that could be all of a sudden a breakout star in week number 1 for the Riders in that matchup against BC. So definitely an option to consider there. The only question is, the Riders have a couple new receivers in the offense. Is how heavily does each get the ball, or do they lean mostly on Shaq Evans and Kyron Moore. But if Fajardo's throwing a lot and he seems to be high on Braden Lenius, then I think we should be too coming into week number 1. And finally, rounding it out by looking at the defenses. Defense is probably one of the more interesting positions strategy-wise, I think, when it comes to CFL Fantasy, because if you look at all the defenses here, they don't bring you massive points week in and week out. Whereas we're talking about some of these receivers and running backs putting up, 15, 16 points a game. The highest points per game out of any defense averaged in 2019 was the Bombers with 9.11, so less than 10 points a game. So they're not going to be fantasy game breakers for you unless they have an outstanding defensive effort where they're putting up, 6, 7 sacks, couple turnovers, maybe holding a team to under 10 points. Sure, you can have weeks where a defense will put up 20 points on the board, but for the most part, those are few and large in between because you have the scoring for defenses where your points are based on the number of points the team allows. More often than not, they're not going to get you premium points that way. Then it comes down to the turnovers and the sacks primarily. So there are some good options, I think, at defense, but I don't think it's the position to build your team around, especially in week number 1, where you're looking at teams probably are going to be a bit sloppy, a bit rusty coming into the season. I think we're going to see a lot of defensive pass interference calls, which are going to lead to scoring position for offenses, which are going to lead to points against. I could see week 1 being a high scoring week with all the teams involved, and the defense is not really benefiting a whole lot from that, those points wise. So defense is one of those positions where, I'm just trying to look to get a couple points out of. If that, certainly a viable strategy is to just not pick a defense and spend your money elsewhere. If you think, a $3,500 or, for example, dollars extra at another position is going to give you a boost of, say 10 points, well, then that's more worth it than picking a defense that on average is going to give you 5 to 7, for example. It's definitely one of those positions where I don't think it makes sense to necessarily pick based on the consistency of the team. It's one where I more so just pick based on the matchups. And in week 1, I think there's a good option here with the Edmonton Elks defense. $3,746. 7.56 points per game in 2019, so kind of middle of the pack there, kind of I believe fifth highest if I'm doing some quick math here. So and they play the Red Blacks offense that I've talked about, could take a bit to get going here, could struggle a bit. The Elks also, I believe, put up the most sacks on defense in the whole league last season. They've got a good defense on paper coming into this year. I like that option of the Elks defense. Only knock on that is, yes, Ottawa might struggle offensively, but Matt Nichols doesn't turn over the ball a whole ton. He's a game manager, right? So they may not feast off of the turnovers in that sense. So maybe a bit of hesitation there. The other obviously good option here, I think, is Hamilton's defense. They put up 8.78 points. They're cheaper than Edmonton's defense at $3,668. So that's not a bad option against Winnipeg as well, especially if they can get on Collaros early, especially if Andrew Harris is potentially not playing this week. Maybe Hamilton's defense can shut that Winnipeg offense down. But the Bombers also have one of the best offensive lines in the league. So are they going to get enough pressure on Zach Collaros to do so? So some interesting options. Those are kind of the leading ones for me as a middle price point for Edmonton and Hamilton there. But I'm certainly not necessarily spending a $5,400 price point on Saskatchewan's defense, for example. I think the difference between that, and the other options I mentioned is $1,700, $1,800. I think that can be better spent at another position where you have the potential to put up bigger points than these defenses do on a consistent basis. So I would fill in a spot on your defense if you can, as it's better to have somebody that could get you points than just leave a spot empty, sure. But I would not build a team around it, especially in week number 1. So that's where we're at for week 1 of CFL Fantasy. You've got your picks at each position that I've got here for you. These are the guys that I'm high on coming into this week. We'll see how it all plays out. I think week 1 is going to be interesting. I think it's always one of those that's hard to predict coming in, because you predict based on last season's stats, but so many guys have changed teams, changed places. It's been 2 years this time around since any of them have last played on top of that. So it could be an unpredictable week. I think it might be one of the tougher weeks to potentially score high in fantasy. But on the other hand, if it's going to be a high scoring week, there should be a lot of fantasy points to go along with that. So these are kind of the options I'm considering myself. I'm still tinkering with a couple lineups featuring most of these guys here as I, check through the depth charts and check through the injury reports leading up to the first game on Thursday night. That's the important part. Make sure you check those out because you don't want to start a guy who's not going to be playing or not going to be starting. So take all of this that I've, put forth here with that grain of salt. Make sure you check the depth charts and injury reports going into week 1. That does it for the week 1 Canadian Football Fantasy Fix. Do all the things if you enjoyed this. Like, subscribe, comment, let me know. Tell me what your fantasy picks are for week 1, which players you like to see in your lineup. And we'll be back next week again. Same place, same time, out Tuesday or Wednesday. And we'll talk through we'll recap week 1 and see, how some of these guys did that we've talked about. And then we'll look ahead to the best fantasy options for week number 2. If you want to check out my other CFL coverage, check out the Canadian Football Countdown podcast on your favorite podcast platform. And then follow me on Twitter as well at CooperTrooper42 to get all of my other CFL thoughts as the season goes along there. And I'll be talking a lot of fantasy football there probably as well as the games are going on throughout the week. So check that all out. Best of luck to you in week 1 of the CFL Fantasy, and hope it's a good week for you. And enjoy the first week of the CFL season. Football is back, and so is CFL Fantasy, and it's a great time. Have a good one. Take care. Bye.